In the harsh winter of 1887, a young woman named Eleanor Walsh stood alone on the platform of Oak Ridge Station, her hope fading with each passing minute. She had traveled over 1,500 miles from Boston to marry a man she had never met, a man who took one look at her and walked away without a word. The reason? She wasn't the slim, delicate bride he had expected from her letters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As the station emptied and darkness fell, Eleanor found herself abandoned in a strange town with nowhere to go. Little did she know that this moment of humiliation would lead to a love story that would change not just her life, but an entire community. Eleanor Walsh sat at her small writing desk, carefully, reviewing the letter one final time before sealing it. At 26, she had long since passed the age when most women in 1887 Boston were expected to be married with children. The daughter of Irish immigrants, Eleanor had spent the last decade caring for her ailing parents until both passed within months of each other the previous year. Now alone in the world, with her prospects for marriage in Boston virtually non-existent, Eleanor had made the bold decision to answer an advertisement in the newspaper. Rancher in Montana Territory seeks educated Christian woman of good character for marriage. Must be practical, hard-working, and willing to embrace frontier life. Eleanor dipped her pen into the inkwell one last time and signed her name with a delicate flourish. She had exchanged a dozen letters with Samuel Brooks over the past 6 months. His letters painted a picture of a hard-working, God-fearing man who had built a respectable cattle ranch near a growing settlement called Oak Ridge. He wrote of needing a partner, someone to help build a proper home, and perhaps, in time, a family. What Eleanor hadn't included in her letters, or in the daguerreotype she had sent, was her full figure. The photographer had been skilled, capturing her face from an angle that highlighted her striking blue eyes and auburn hair while minimizing her size. Eleanor knew she wasn't built like the fashionable women in Boston society magazines, with their impossibly tiny waists enhanced by tightly laced corsets. She was substantial, strong-boned, with the sturdy build that had allowed her to lift and care for her father during his final years. "You're doing the right thing, Ellie," Mrs. Abernathy, her elderly neighbor, reassured her as she helped Eleanor pack her trunk. "There's nothing left for you here, and frontier men need strong women, not these fragile city flowers who'd wilt at the first sign of hard work." Eleanor nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. "What if he's disappointed when he sees me?" she asked. "Quietly." "Nonsense," Mrs. Abernathy replied, folding Eleanor's Sunday dress with careful hands. "He's getting a woman who can read and write, keep accounts, cook a decent meal, and won't complain about hard work. If he can't see your worth, then he doesn't deserve you." The train journey west was long and arduous. Eleanor watched as the familiar brick buildings of Boston gave way to rolling farmland, then vast prairies, and finally the rugged foothills that signaled they were approaching Montana Territory. She spent the journey reading from her small collection of books and writing in her journal, recording her thoughts and fears as she headed toward an uncertain future. "Final stop, Oak Ridge Station," the conductor called, startling Eleanor from her thoughts. With trembling hands, she gathered her belongings. Samuel had promised to meet her at the station, and they would be married by the local minister that very day. The platform was busy with people greeting loved ones, collecting freight, and going about their business. Eleanor stepped down from the train, her heart pounding. She wore her best dress, navy blue wool with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs, and had pinned her hair in a neat bun beneath her hat. She looked around anxiously, searching for a man who matched the description Samuel had provided, tall, with light brown hair and a well-trimmed beard. After several minutes of scanning the crowd, Eleanor spotted a man staring at her from the edge of the platform. He matched Samuel's description, but instead of approaching with a welcoming smile, he continued to stare with an expression that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with dread. Finally he approached, his boots clicking against the wooden platform. "Miss Walsh?" he asked, his voice cool. "Yes, Mr. Brooks," Eleanor replied, trying to keep the nervous tremor from her voice. Samuel Brooks looked her up and down, making no attempt to hide his assessment. His eyes lingered on her waist and hips, his frown deepening. "You didn't mention your size in your letters." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. I suppose I didn't think it relevant to our correspondence," she stammered. Samuel scoffed. "Not relevant? I need a wife who can work alongside me, not someone who'll slow me down." He took a step back. "This won't work. I'm sorry you've come all this way for nothing, but I can't marry you." Eleanor stood frozen, the words striking her like physical blows. But we had an agreement," she whispered. "I've sold everything I owned. I have nowhere to go." "That's not my concern," Samuel replied coldly. "There's a women's boarding house in town. Perhaps they can take you in until you figure out what to do." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone with her trunk and carpetbag as curious onlookers pretended not to stare. As the platform gradually emptied, Eleanor remained rooted to the spot, shock and humiliation washing over her in waves. The journey had depleted most of her savings. She had enough for perhaps a week at a boarding house, but then what? Return to Boston in disgrace? She had no home to return to, having sold the small house she had shared with her parents to finance this journey. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the now empty platform. The station agent, an elderly man with kind eyes, approached cautiously. "Miss, the last train's gone for the day. Do you have somewhere to go?" Eleanor blinked back tears. "Is there a boarding house nearby that might take me in, just for a few days while I decide what to do?" The agent's expression softened with pity. "Mrs. Holloway runs a respectable place just down the main street. Not too expensive either. Shall I help you with your trunk?" "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, humiliated that her predicament was so obvious. As they made their way slowly down the dusty main street of Oakridge, Eleanor became acutely aware of how different this frontier town was from Boston. A single, muddy thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings, most of them businesses with simple signs: general store, blacksmith, saloon, sheriff's office. Men in dusty work clothes and wide-brimmed hats paused in their conversations to watch her pass, their curious gazes making her shrink further into herself. Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was a two-story wooden structure with a small sign in the window. The station agent knocked on the door, and after a moment it swung open to reveal a thin, severe-looking woman in her 50s. "Mrs. Holloway, this young lady needs lodging," the station agent explained. "Just arrived from back east, Mrs." Holloway's sharp eyes took in Eleanor's travel-worn appearance. "I have one room available, $5 a week, meals included. No gentlemen callers, no alcohol, and no coming in after 9 in the evening." Eleanor nodded meekly. "Thank you. I'll take it just for a week while I sort things out." After the station agent helped bring her trunk upstairs, Eleanor was left alone in the small, sparse room with its narrow bed, washstand, and single chair. Only then did she allow the tears to fall freely, muffling her sobs with her handkerchief so the other boarders wouldn't hear. How could she have been so foolish to travel across the country to marry a man she had never met, selling everything she owned on the promise of a new life? Now she was stranded in this wilderness town, nearly penniless, with no prospects and no plan. The next morning, after a nearly sleepless night, Eleanor forced herself to eat a small breakfast in Mrs. Holloway's dining room, ignoring the curious glances from the other two female boarders, a schoolteacher and a seamstress. Afterward, She set out to explore the town, hoping to find work that would allow her to either save enough to return east or establish herself here. The general store seemed the most promising place to start. The bell above the door jingled as Eleanor entered, her gaze taking in the shelves stocked with everything from tools and fabric to preserved foods and medicines. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Good morning, miss. Can I help you find something?" he asked. "Actually," Eleanor began hesitantly, "I was wondering if you might be in need of assistance in your store. I'm good with numbers and inventory, and I've managed a household budget for years." The storekeeper's friendly expression dimmed. "I'm afraid not, miss. My wife and daughter help me run the place. We don't need extra hands." He paused, studying her. "You must be the Eastern lady who came in on yesterday's train. Word travels fast in a small town like Oakridge." Eleanor's cheeks burned with the realization that her humiliation was now common knowledge. "Yes, well, thank you anyway," she murmured, turning to leave. Her inquiries at the dress shop, the small hotel, and even the schoolhouse met with similar rejections. By mid-afternoon, with the sun beating down mercilessly, Eleanor's spirits had sunk to their lowest point. She found herself at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. In the distance, she could see rolling hills and scattered homesteads. A small creek ran nearby, and Eleanor made her way to it, sitting heavily on a flat rock beside the water. What was she to do? Her week at Mrs. Holloway's would quickly exhaust her remaining funds. The humiliation of Samuel's rejection still stung sharply, made worse by the knowledge that everyone in town seemed aware of her situation. "You look like you could use some company." A deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Eleanor turned to see a man leading a horse to the creek to drink. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a short beard, streaked with premature grey. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but of good quality, a cattle rancher or successful farmer, she guessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm fine, thank you," Eleanor replied stiffly, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. The man allowed his horse to drink before speaking again. "You must be new to Oakridge. I'm Matthew Harrison." He didn't extend his hand, maintaining a respectful distance that Eleanor appreciated. "Eleanor Walsh," she replied cautiously. Matthew nodded. "Boston accent, you've come a long way." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I heard about what happened at the station yesterday. Brooks never was known for his good character." Eleanor stiffened. "I see news travels quickly here." "Small towns." Matthew shrugged apologetically. "For what it's worth, most folks think Brooks behaved shamefully. A man should honor his commitments." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. "Well, thank you for your concern, Mr. Harrison, but I'd rather not discuss it." Matthew nodded respectfully. "Fair enough. May I ask what you plan to do now?" "I'm looking for work," Eleanor admitted after a moment, "though it seems opportunities are limited for someone in my situation." Matthew was quiet for a moment, then said, "My sister-in-law runs the town's only restaurant, the Plains Cafe, just off Main Street. She's been looking for help with cooking and serving. If you're interested, I could put in a word." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by the offer. "Why would you help me? You don't know anything about me." Matthew's weathered face broke into a slight smile. "Let's just say I've seen enough of life to know that sometimes good people find themselves in difficult circumstances through no fault of their own." He paused. "And my sister-in-law really does need help. Her last cook quit to get married last month." For the first time since arriving in Oakridge, Eleanor felt a small flicker of hope. "I'm a good cook," she said. "My mother taught me everything. She knew, and we took in boarders back in Boston, so I'm used to cooking for many people." "Perfect," Matthew replied. "Why don't you come by the cafe tomorrow morning around 7? I'll let Sarah know to expect you." As Matthew led his horse away, Eleanor remained by the creek, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. The encounter had been unexpected, but perhaps this was the opportunity she needed, a chance to earn enough money to either build a new life here or return east with her dignity intact. The Plains Café was a modest establishment with 6 tables inside and a small counter. When Eleanor arrived the next morning, she found a harried-looking woman in her 30s attempting to serve breakfast to a table of ranch hands while simultaneously flipping pancakes on the stove. "Mrs. Harrison?" Eleanor asked tentatively. The woman looked up, blowing a strand of blonde hair from her face. "You must be Eleanor. Matt told me about you." She gestured toward the kitchen. "Can you manage those pancakes while I get these orders?" "Out. We'll talk after the breakfast rush." Eleanor immediately removed her coat and rolled up her sleeves. She was in her element here, quickly taking over the cooking, while Sarah delivered plates to the hungry customers. By the time the breakfast crowd thinned, Eleanor had impressed Sarah with her efficiency and cooking skills. Matt didn't mention. "You were a professional," Sarah remarked as they cleaned up. "Those were the best pancakes I've served in months." Eleanor smiled modestly. "I'm not professional, but I've been cooking since I was tall enough to reach the stove. My mother ran a boarding house, so I learned to cook for large groups." Sarah studied her thoughtfully. "I can offer you room and board plus $2 a week to start. If business picks up with your cooking, we can discuss a raise." She hesitated. "The room's small, just a converted storage space upstairs, but it's clean and private." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Harrison. I accept." "Sarah, please," the other woman insisted. "We don't stand on formality here." She hesitated, then added gently, "Matt told me about what happened with Samuel Brooks. That man has a mean streak a mile wide. You're better off without him, though I'm sorry for what you've been through." Eleanor nodded, unwilling to discuss the humiliation further. "When would you like me to start?" "How about right now?" Sarah replied with a smile. "Lunch crowd will be in soon, and I could use the help." Over the next few days, Eleanor threw herself into her work at the cafe. The physical labor of cooking and serving from dawn until dusk left her pleasantly exhausted, with little energy to dwell on her situation. Sarah proved to be a kind employer, and Eleanor gradually began to learn the rhythms of the small frontier town. Matthew Harrison stopped by the cafe every few days, sometimes for a meal, other times just for coffee. Eleanor learned that he owned the largest cattle ranch in the area, the Double H, which he had built from nothing after coming west following the Civil War. His wife had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, leaving him to raise their son, Thomas, now 10 years old, alone. "He rarely comes to town," Sarah explained one afternoon as they watched Matthew ride away. "Been something of a recluse since Mary died. The fact that he's been showing up here so regularly, well, it's caught people's attention." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure he's just checking on how your new cook is working out." Sarah gave her a knowing look, but said nothing more. As word spread about the new cook at the Plains Café, business increased. Eleanor began experimenting with recipes, introducing dishes she had learned from her Irish mother alongside American standards. Her bread pudding became particularly famous, with ranchers sometimes riding for miles specifically to have a serving. One evening, as Eleanor was closing up the cafe, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to see Matthew Harrison, looking more cleaned up than usual in a fresh shirt, his hair still damp from what appeared to be a recent bath. "We're just closing," Eleanor said, then realized who it was. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, is everything all right?" Matthew shifted uncomfortably, holding his hat in his hands. "Everything's fine, Miss Walsh. I was hoping to catch you before you retired for the evening." He cleared his throat. "I wanted to ask if you might join me for a buggy ride on Sunday afternoon, after church services, of course." Eleanor stared at him, momentarily speechless. Was Matthew Harrison asking to court her? I understand if you'd rather not, Matthew added quickly, misinterpreting her silence. I just thought you might like to see more of the countryside since you've been working so hard. Eleanor found her voice. That would be lovely, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for the invitation. A smile transformed Matthew's usually serious face. Excellent. I'll call for you after the service. He placed his hat back on his head and nodded. Good night, Miss Walsh. As he left, Eleanor couldn't help but smile to herself. Perhaps there was hope for a new beginning in Oakridge after all. Sunday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the small window of Eleanor's room above the cafe. She had spent the previous evening carefully pressing her best dress, the same navy blue wool she had worn upon arrival, but now adorned with a fresh white collar she had purchased with her first wages. The local church was a simple wooden structure, with a modest steeple, but what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in the warmth of its congregation. As Eleanor slipped into a pew near the back, she noticed several patrons from the cafe nodding in recognition. "Miss Walsh, please join us," called a friendly voice. It was Mrs. Peterson, wife of the town's blacksmith and a regular breakfast. Customer Eleanor hesitantly moved to sit with the Peterson family, grateful for the kindness. Throughout the service, she found herself glancing around for Matthew, finally spotting him several rows ahead with a young boy she assumed was his. Son Thomas. The child had his father's strong profile, but fairer hair that must have come from his mother. After the final hymn, parishioners spilled out into the churchyard, gathering in small groups to socialize. Eleanor stood awkwardly on the periphery, until she felt a gentle touch on her elbow. "Miss Walsh," Matthew greeted her, his deep voice warm. Beside him stood the boy, regarding her with curious eyes. "I'd like you to meet my son, Thomas. Thomas, this is Miss Eleanor Walsh." "How do you do, ma'am?" Thomas said politely, though his expression remained wary. "Very well, thank you, Thomas." Eleanor replied with a gentle smile. "Your father speaks of you often." The boy glanced at his father with surprise, as if unused to being the subject of conversation. "The buggy's ready whenever you are," Matthew said. "Well, we thought we might show you Whitefish Lake. It's about an hour's ride from here. Quite pretty this time of year." Eleanor nodded. "That sounds lovely. I just need to tell Sarah I'm leaving." After a quick word with her employer, who winked at her encouragingly, Eleanor allowed Matthew to help her into the buggy. Thomas scrambled up to sit between them, creating a buffer that Eleanor suspected was intentional on the boy's part. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into rolling prairie dotted with wildflowers. Matthew pointed out landmarks as they rode, distant mountains, a neighbor's homestead, wild horses grazing in the distance. "Have you always lived in Oakridge?" Eleanor asked, addressing both father and son. "Pa came here after the war," Thomas answered. "But I was born here, never been anywhere else." "I was in New York briefly after the war," Matthew elaborated. "But it was too crowded, too many memories. I headed west with nothing but a horse and what I could carry." He gestured toward the horizon. "I staked my claim, built the cabin myself, and started with just a few head of cattle. Now the Double H runs over 500 head. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Eleanor found herself admiring his determination. "What about you, Miss Walsh?" Thomas asked. "Did you always live in Boston?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much the boy knew about her circumstances. "Yes, all my life until recently. My parents came from Ireland during the potato famine, before I was born. We had a small house where we took in boarders, other Irish immigrants mostly." "Why'd you come all the way out here then?" Thomas pressed, his childlike directness making Eleanor's cheeks warm. "Thomas," Matthew warned quietly. "It's all right," Eleanor assured him. "I came for a fresh start, Thomas. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, and we find ourselves on new paths we never anticipated." The boy considered this. Like when Ma died, and everything changed for me and Pa. Eleanor glanced at Matthew, whose expression had grown solemn. Yes, something like that, she said softly. They rode in companionable silence for a while until the landscape began to change, with more trees dotting the rolling hills. Finally, they created a rise, and Whitefish Lake came into view, a pristine blue expanse surrounded by pines. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed. Matthew directed the horses to a shady spot overlooking the water. From the back of the buggy, he produced a wicker basket. "Sarah insisted on packing us a picnic, said you've been feeding half the county and deserved to have someone cook for you for a change." They spread a blanket on the grass, and Eleanor discovered that Sarah had outdone herself. Fried chicken, potato salad, fresh biscuits, and apple pie. As they ate, the initial awkwardness faded. Thomas gradually warmed up to Eleanor, especially when she expressed genuine interest in his stories about school and his pony. After they finished eating, Thomas asked permission to explore the shoreline. Within sight of the picnic spot, as the boys skipped stones across the water, Matthew and Eleanor sat in a comfortable silence watching him. "He's a wonderful boy," Eleanor observed. "You've done well raising him on your own." Matthew's expression softened as he watched his son. "It hasn't been easy. There are things a boy needs his mother for." He glanced at Eleanor. "Sarah helps when she can, but she has her own household to manage." "I can imagine it must be difficult," Eleanor said gently. Matthew turned to face her directly. "Miss Walsh, Eleanor, if I may, I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not a man who has a way with fancy words or courtship, but I've come to admire you greatly these past weeks." Eleanor felt her heart quicken. "Mr. Harrison." "Matthew, please." "Matthew," she corrected, "you hardly know me." "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know you're courageous. It takes real bravery to travel across the country alone to build a new life. I know you're hard-working and skilled. I've never seen the cafe so busy since you started cooking there. I know you're kind. I've watched how you treat everyone, from the wealthy ranchers to the cowboys who can barely afford a hot meal." Eleanor felt her cheeks grow warm at his assessment. "That's very kind of you to say." Matthew shook his head. "It's not kindness, just the truth as I see it." He hesitated. "I also know that Samuel Brooks is a fool who couldn't recognize your value when it was standing right in front of him." Eleanor's breath caught at the directness of his statement. "Most men would share his assessment," she said quietly. "I'm not built like the ladies in fashion magazines." Matthew's expression grew serious. "Out here we value strength and substance over superficial things. A woman who can work alongside her husband, who has the fortitude to endure hardship without complaint, that's what matters on the frontier." His eyes held hers steadily. "You're beautiful, Eleanor, not despite your size, but because of everything that you are." For a moment Eleanor couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. Before she could formulate a response, Thomas came running back, proudly displaying a unique stone he had found. The moment had passed, but something had shifted between them. As they packed up the picnic and headed back toward town, Eleanor found herself studying Matthew's profile when he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes that spoke of a man who smiled more than he let on. In the weeks that followed, Matthew became a regular presence at the cafe. Sometimes he would bring Thomas, other times he would come alone, sitting at the counter and talking. With Eleanor as she worked, word spread quickly through the small town, and Eleanor often caught patrons exchanging knowing glances when Matthew appeared. Sarah observed the budding relationship with obvious approval. "Matt hasn't shown interest in any woman since Mary died," she confided to Eleanor one evening as they closed the cafe. "He's been too focused on the ranch and raising Thomas." I was beginning to worry he'd spend the rest of his life alone. "We're just friends," Eleanor protested, though her racing heart whenever Matthew entered the cafe suggested otherwise. "Of course you are," Sarah replied with a knowing smile. One afternoon in late spring, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and Eleanor looked up to see Samuel Brooks entering with another man. They took a table by the window, and Samuel deliberately avoided looking in her direction. Eleanor felt her stomach clench, but she straightened her shoulders and approached their table with her order pad. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. What can I get for you today?" she asked, her voice steady despite her churning emotions. Samuel finally looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and discomfort, upon realizing Eleanor would be serving them. "Coffee," he muttered, "and whatever the special is." "Same for me," his companion added, looking curiously between Samuel and Eleanor. As Eleanor turned to place their order, she overheard Samuel's companion ask in a low voice, "Isn't that the mail-order bride you were telling me about? The one who was too—" "Keep your voice down," Samuel hissed. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she poured their coffee, the humiliation of that first day rushing back. She was considering asking Sarah to take over their table when the bell jingled again and Matthew entered. His eyes immediately found hers, his smile fading as he took in her distress. His gaze shifted to Samuel's table and his expression hardened. With understanding, without hesitation, Matthew walked directly to Eleanor. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, though her tight smile betrayed her. "Just serving customers." Matthew studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Instead of taking his usual seat at the counter, he pulled out a chair at the table closest to where Samuel sat. He didn't say anything to the other man, but his presence spoke volumes, a silent statement of support that Eleanor appreciated, more than words could express. Later, after Samuel and his friend had departed with minimal interaction, Matthew lingered until the cafe emptied of other customers. "I apologize if I overstepped," he said, as Eleanor wiped down tables, "but I couldn't stand by while that man made you uncomfortable." Eleanor paused in her work. "You didn't overstep. Thank you for your support." She hesitated. "It's foolish, I know, but seeing him still brings back the shame of that day." Matthew's expression grew serious. "You have nothing to be ashamed of, Eleanor. The shame belongs entirely to him." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Would you have dinner with me this Saturday? Not at the cafe, but at the ranch. I'd like you to see my home, to meet the real Thomas beyond his Sunday manners." The invitation represented a significant step forward in their relationship, and Eleanor knew it. "I'd like that very much," she replied softly. Saturday evening found Eleanor nervously approaching the Double H Ranch in a buggy driven by Sarah's husband, who had offered to take her out and bring her back to town afterward. The ranch house was larger than Eleanor had expected, a substantial two-story structure built of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Flower beds lined the front of the house, and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. Matthew greeted her at the door, looking uncharacteristically nervous himself. "Welcome to the Double H," he said, helping her down from the buggy. Thomas appeared. Behind his father, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Eleanor had brought a small gift for him, a book of adventure stories she had ordered from the general store. "Mrs. Peterson said you were a good reader," she explained as she handed it to him. "I thought you might enjoy these stories." Thomas accepted the gift with widening eyes. "Thank you, Miss Walsh," he said, immediately opening the cover to examine the illustrations. Inside, Eleanor discovered that Matthew had gone to considerable effort for the evening. The table was set with what appeared to be the family's best dishes, and delicious smells wafted from the kitchen. "You cooked?" Eleanor asked, surprised. Matthew gave a self-deprecating smile. I'm no chef, but I can manage a decent roast and potatoes. Mary taught me some basics before she passed, said no man should be entirely helpless in a kitchen. The mention of his late wife didn't carry the shadow of grief that Eleanor might have expected. Instead, Matthew spoke of Mary with gentle remembrance rather than raw pain, the way one might recall a beloved friend from long ago. During dinner, Eleanor observed the easy relationship between father and son. Despite Matthew's imposing physical presence, he was patient and attentive with Thomas, clearly prioritizing the boy's well-being above all else. After the meal, Thomas proudly showed Eleanor around the ranch, his pony in the stable, the chickens he was responsible for feeding, and finally his mother's garden, which he and Matthew maintained in her memory. "Pa says the flowers make the house feel like a home," Thomas explained, his young face serious. Ma loved them, especially the purple ones. As the sky darkened, Thomas reluctantly went inside to prepare for bed, leaving Matthew and Eleanor alone. On the porch, they sat side by side in rocking chairs, watching as stars appeared one by one in the vast Montana sky. "You've built something wonderful here," Eleanor said softly. "A true home," Matthew nodded. It was Mary's dream as much as mine. When we first arrived, there was nothing but open prairie and a small cabin left by a trapper. She never complained, even during that first brutal winter when we nearly froze. He paused, looking out at the land that stretched before them. "She would have liked you, I think." The simple statement touched Eleanor deeply. "I wish I could have known her." "She would have appreciated your practical nature," Matthew continued. "And your cooking." His mouth quivered in a half-smile. "Mine doesn't compare." Eleanor laughed softly. "The meal was lovely, truly." They rocked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle creaking of the chairs and the distant lowing of cattle. "Eleanor," Matthew finally said, his deep voice breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately, about what I want for Thomas, for myself." He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the lantern light. "Before I met you, I had resigned myself to raising Thomas alone, focusing on the ranch and nothing else, but these past weeks have shown me that perhaps there could be more." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Matthew, I'm not asking for anything now," he assured her quickly. "I just want you to know that my intentions are serious. I care for you, Eleanor, more deeply than I expected to care for anyone again. But I understand that you came west for one future and found yourself thrust into something entirely different. You deserve time to decide what you truly want." Eleanor studied his face, this good man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness since the moment they met. "I care for you too," she admitted softly. "And for Thomas. More than I thought possible in such a short time." Relief and joy transformed Matthew's usually solemn features. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her lips. It was brief and chaste, but it held a promise that made Eleanor's breath or catch. When Mr. Harrison arrived to take her back to town, Matthew helped her into the buggy, his hand lingering on hers. "Sunday services tomorrow?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Yes, I'll see you both there." As the buggy pulled away, Eleanor glanced back to see Matthew and Thomas standing on the porch, father and son waving. "Goodbye." For the first time since arriving in Montana territory, Eleanor felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that perhaps this unexpected detour in her life's journey had led her exactly where she was meant to be. As the warm days of spring gave way to the heat of summer, Eleanor found herself settling into a comfortable rhythm. Weekdays were spent at the cafe, where her cooking had become renowned throughout the county. Sundays were reserved for church, services followed by afternoons with Matthew and Thomas, sometimes at the lake, other times at the ranch. The townspeople had largely accepted Eleanor's presence in their community, particularly as her connection to Matthew Harrison became more apparent. The story of her arrival had transformed from one of humiliation to one of providence. How fortunate that Samuel Brooks had revealed his true character before marriage, allowing Eleanor to find happiness with a far better man. But not everyone viewed the situation so charitably. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner who had first taken Eleanor in, was among those who still regarded her with suspicion. "Quite the reversal of fortune," Mrs. Holloway remarked one morning when she stopped by the cafe for tea. "From abandoned mail-order bride to courting the wealthiest rancher in the county. Some might call that calculated." Eleanor's hand stilled on the teapot. "I assure you, Mrs. Holloway, nothing about my situation was planned." The older woman smiled thinly. "Of course not, dear. I'm simply observing how fortunate you've been, considering your circumstances." Her gaze flickered meaningfully over Eleanor's figure. Sarah, overhearing from behind the counter, stepped forward. "Your tea's on the house today, Mrs. Holloway," she said firmly, "and perhaps we can interest you in some apple pie. Eleanor baked it fresh this morning." The pointed kindness wasn't lost on Mrs. Holloway, who sniffed disapprovingly but accepted the free refreshments. After she left, Sarah squeezed Eleanor's shoulder. "Pay her no mind. She's been the town gossip for 20 years. Some people simply can't bear to see others happy." Eleanor nodded, though the encounter had left her unsettled. She'd been naive to think that her relationship with Matthew wouldn't invite speculation and judgment. In a frontier town where entertainment was scarce, other people's affairs often became the primary source of amusement. That evening, as Eleanor closed the cafe, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, expecting to see a late customer, only to find Thomas Harrison standing there alone, his expression troubled. "Thomas, is everything all right? Where's your father?" "Pa's at the ranch," the boy replied, scuffing his boot against the floor. "He doesn't know I'm here. I borrowed Daisy." At Eleanor's alarmed expression, he added quickly, "My pony, she's tied up outside." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron. "Does your father know you've ridden into town alone?" Thomas shook his head, looking guilty. "I told him I was going fishing at the creek on our property." His young face grew serious. "I needed to talk to you, Miss Walsh, alone." Concerned by the boy's unusual behavior, Eleanor gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Thomas. Would you like some milk and a slice of pie while we talk?" The boy nodded, his solemn expression lightening slightly at the mention of pie. Eleanor quickly served him before sitting across the table, giving him her full attention. "Now, what's so important that you'd risk your father's displeasure by coming to town alone?" Thomas fidgeted with his fork. "It's about you and Pa." He looked up, his eyes, so like his father's, studying her intently. "Are you going to marry him?" The directness of the question took Eleanor by surprise. "Your father hasn't asked me to marry him, Thomas." "But he will," the boy stated with certainty. "I heard him talking to Uncle James about it. He said he was waiting for the right moment, but that he was certain about his feelings." Eleanor's heart fluttered at this revelation, but she kept her expression composed. "If your father does ask me such a question someday, how would you feel about that, Thomas?" The boy took a bite of pie, considering. "That's why I came to talk to you. I needed to ask you something important first." "You can ask me anything," Eleanor assured him. Thomas set down his fork, his young face suddenly appearing much older than his 10 years. "If you marry Pa, would you try to make us forget about my ma?" The question pierced Eleanor's heart. "Oh, Thomas, no. I would never want to replace your mother or erase her memory." She reached across the table to gently touch his hand. "Your mother will always be a part of you and your father, and that's as it should be. She gave you life. She loved you, and she helped make your father the man he is today." Thomas's eyes searched hers, looking for sincerity. "Mrs. Peterson said her sister remarried after her husband died, and the new husband didn't like it when she talked about her first husband. He took down all the pictures and everything. Eleanor shook her head firmly. That would never happen. In your home, Thomas. The garden you and your father tend in your mother's memory, the stories you tell about her, these are precious things that should be preserved. She squeezed his hand. If, and that's still an if, your father and I were ever to marry, I would want to know all about your mother. I would want to see her pictures and hear stories about her. She would always be honored in your home. The tension visibly drained from Thomas's shoulders. That's what I hoped you'd say, he admitted, returning to his pie with renewed enthusiasm. Eleanor studied the boy as he ate, touched by his concern and the maturity he showed in addressing it directly. Thomas, I think we should get you home before your father discovers you're missing and worries. The boy nodded, reluctantly pushing away his empty plate. Will you tell Pa I came to town? Eleanor considered the question. I don't believe in keeping secrets from people we care about, but I'll explain to your father that you came to me with an important concern and that you handled it very maturely. I think he'll be proud of you for caring so deeply about your family, even if he's not happy about you riding to town alone. Thomas accepted this with a nod. Eleanor quickly closed up the cafe and borrowed Sarah's buggy, which was kept behind the building. She insisted on driving Thomas back to the ranch herself, unwilling to let the boy make the return journey alone as dusk approached. As they neared the Double H, they could see Matthew on horseback, clearly preparing to ride out. In search of his son, when he spotted the buggy, he galloped toward them, his expression a mixture of relief and anger. "Thomas James Harrison," he called sternly as they pulled to a stop. "Where have you been? I've been searching the creek for the past hour, fearing you'd fallen in." Thomas hung his head. "I'm sorry, Pa. I went to town to talk to Miss Walsh." Matthew's worried gaze shifted to Eleanor, silently questioning. "He had some concerns he wanted to discuss with me," Eleanor explained. "I've told him that while his initiative in addressing his worries was admirable, his method was not. That's why I insisted on bringing him home myself." Matthew helped her down from the buggy, his hand lingering on hers, slightly longer than necessary. "Thank you for seeing him home safely." To Thomas he added, "Go inside and wash up for dinner. We'll discuss your punishment afterward." As the boy trudged toward the house, Eleanor touched Matthew's arm. "Don't be too hard on him. His concerns were genuine, and he showed great maturity in how he expressed them." "What concerns?" Matthew asked, his brow furrowed. Eleanor hesitated. "He overheard you discussing the possibility of marriage with your brother James." Matthew's expression shifted from confusion to embarrassment. "I see." He ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't how I planned to broach the subject with you." Despite the seriousness of the moment, Eleanor couldn't help but smile. "No, I imagine not." Her expression softened. "Thomas wanted to make sure that if such a thing were to happen, I wouldn't try to erase his mother's memory from your lives." Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. "And what did you tell him?" "That his mother will always be an important part of your family, and that if we were ever to marry, I would want to honor her memory, not diminish it." Matthew's gaze, warm and appreciative, held hers. That was exactly the right answer. He glanced toward the house, then back at Eleanor. "Would you stay for dinner? I think Thomas and I both could use your calming presence for the conversation ahead." Eleanor nodded. "I'd be happy to." That evening marked a subtle shift in their relationship. Though no formal proposal had been made, the possibility of marriage now hung in the air between them, acknowledged, if not yet pursued. The following weeks brought an unexpected challenge. To Oak Ridge, a prolonged drought had left the surrounding countryside parched, and ranchers began to worry about water for their herds and crops for the winter. Matthew, whose ranch had access to Whitefish Creek, fared better than most, but even he felt the strain. One evening in late July, Eleanor was just finishing her work at the cafe when Matthew arrived, looking tired and dusty from a long day on. "The range. You look exhausted," she said, bringing him coffee without being asked. Matthew accepted the cup gratefully. "It's been a difficult day. 3 of my neighbors have lost cattle to dehydration. They've asked for permission to water their herds at my creek." "Surely you'll allow it?" Eleanor asked. Matthew nodded. "Of course. We help each other out here. That's the only way to survive." He sipped his coffee. But tensions are high. Samuel Brooks was among those asking for access. He glanced at Eleanor. He wasn't particularly gracious about it. Eleanor felt a familiar twinge at the mention of Samuel's name. "I imagine not." Matthew studied her face. "Does it still bother you? What did he did?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Not in the way it once did. The humiliation has faded." She smiled faintly. "I suppose I should thank him in a way. If he hadn't rejected me, I might never have met you." Matthew reached across the counter to take her hand. "His loss, my considerable gain." The bell above. The door jingled, interrupting the moment. Sheriff Miller entered, his expression grave. "Matt," he greeted with a nod. "Thought I'd find you here. Got some troubling news. Fire's been spotted in the eastern foothills. With everything so dry and the wind picking up, we could have a serious problem on our hands." Matthew immediately stood. "How far?" "About 15 miles out, but moving this way. I'm gathering every able-bodied man to create fire breaks." "Can I count on you and your hands?" "Of course," Matthew replied. He turned to Eleanor. "I need to get back to the ranch, gather my men." He hesitated. "Thomas?" "Bring him to me," Eleanor said without hesitation. "He can stay with me above the cafe until the danger has passed." Relief washed over Matthew's features. "Thank you. I'll send him in with one of the hands right away." Within the hour, Thomas arrived with a small bundle of belongings, his young face tense with worry. "Is Pa going to be all right?" he asked Eleanor as soon as they were alone. "Your father is the most capable man I know," Eleanor assured him, though her own heart was tight with concern. "And he's not fighting the fire alone. The whole town is working together." That night, Eleanor brought a cot into her small room above the cafe, setting it up for Thomas while she took the narrow bed. Despite the boy's protests that he wasn't frightened, she noticed how tightly he clutched his blanket, his eyes frequently darting to the window where an ominous orange glow now tinted the horizon. "Would you like me to read to you from your adventure book?" Eleanor offered, sitting on the edge of his cot. Thomas shook his head. "Could you—" he hesitated. "Could you tell me about when you were little instead? What was Boston like?" Understanding his need for distraction, Eleanor began to share stories of her childhood, the busy streets, the harbor filled with ships from around the world, the Irish community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Thomas listened raptly, his tense posture gradually relaxing. "Your life was so different from mine," he observed sleepily as her stories wound down. Eleanor smoothed his hair, a maternal gesture that came naturally. "Different, yes, but with similarities too. We both know what it's like to lose parents we loved. We both understand the importance of home and family." Thomas's eyes, heavy with approaching sleep, studied her face. "You'd make a good ma," he murmured before his eyelids finally closed. Eleanor sat beside him for a long while, his simple statement echoing in her heart. She had never thought much about motherhood, having spent her youth caring for aging parents rather than considering children of her own. Yet sitting here, watching over this boy who had come to mean so much to her, she could imagine herself in that role, not replacing the mother he had lost, but offering a different kind of maternal love. Outside, the orange glow on the horizon intensified. Eleanor moved to the window, saying a silent prayer for Matthew and all the men fighting to protect their homes and livelihoods. For 3 days, Oak Ridge existed in a state of anxious suspense. Most of the men were away fighting the fire, leaving the women, children, and elderly to maintain essential services and prepare for possible evacuation. Eleanor kept the cafe open round the clock, serving meals to exhausted firefighters who staggered into town for brief breaks before returning to the line. Thomas proved himself invaluable, helping Eleanor with simple tasks in the kitchen and delivering food to those unable to come to the cafe. His worry for his father was evident, but he channeled it into productive action, earning admiration from the townspeople. On the evening of the third day, as Eleanor was preparing another batch of sandwiches to send to the fire line, the cafe door burst open. Matthew stood there, his clothing smoke-stained, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes bright with relief. "It's contained," he announced to the room at large. The wind shifted, and we managed to direct the fire away from town and the ranches. A cheer went up from the patrons. Thomas launched himself at his father, who caught him in a fierce embrace despite his evident exhaustion. "You smell terrible, Pa," the boy said, his face buried in Matthew's shirt. Matthew laughed, the sound slightly hoarse from smoke exposure. "That's what happens when you spend 3 days fighting fire, son." He looked over Thomas's head to meet Eleanor's eyes, his expression softening. "Thank you for taking care of him." "He took care of me as much as I cared for him," Eleanor replied honestly, unable to keep the relief and affection from her voice. Later, after Matthew had cleaned up using the washroom behind the cafe and eaten a proper meal, he and Eleanor sat at a quiet table while Thomas dozed in a chair nearby, exhaustion having finally caught up with the boy. "The fire came within a mile of the Double H," Matthew told her quietly. "We lost the north pasture and a part of the east ridge, but the house and barns are intact. Some weren't so fortunate. The Millers lost their entire homestead." Eleanor's hand covered his. "What will they do? Rebuild. That's what we do out here." Matthew turned his hand to clasp hers. "The community will help. Barn raising, sharing supplies, taking in the children until a new house is built." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "It's the way of things on the frontier. We depend on each other." Eleanor nodded, understanding deeper meanings in his words. Here, no one could survive alone. Interdependence wasn't a weakness, but a strength, a lesson far different from the individualistic values she had grown up with in Boston. "Eleanor," Matthew began, his voice low and serious, "these past days, not knowing if I'd lose everything, there was one thought that kept returning." He met her gaze steadily. "If the house burned, if the cattle died, if all material possessions were lost, none of it would matter as long as Thomas was safe and you were still here." Eleanor's breath caught. "Matthew," he pressed on, "I know this isn't the romantic proposal you deserve. I'm exhausted, smoke-stained, and we're sitting in a cafe with my son drooling on a chair nearby." His mouth quivered in a half-smile. "But the fire has taught me not to wait for perfect moments that might never come." He squeezed her hand. "I love you, Eleanor Walsh. I think I began falling in love with you that first day by the creek, when you sat so proudly despite your circumstances." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as Matthew continued, his deep voice resonating with sincerity. "You've brought joy back into my life and Thomas's when we thought it might never return. You've shown strength, kindness, and a generous heart to everyone you meet. I cannot imagine my future without you in it." He pulled a small object from his pocket, a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me these past 3 days, thinking of you while we fought the fire. Eleanor Walsh, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Eleanor stared at the simple gold band glinting in Matthew's palm, her heart thundering in her chest. The cafe had emptied as the hour grew late, leaving only the three of them, Matthew, Eleanor, and the sleeping Thomas, in the quiet space illuminated by oil lamps. "I know it's happening quickly," Matthew added in the silence. "If you need time." Yes, Eleanor interrupted, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I'll marry you, Matthew. Joy transformed his exhausted features as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit nearly perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Matthew rose from his seat and pulled Eleanor to her feet, drawing her into a tender embrace. When their lips met, it was a kiss filled with promise, of home, of family, of a future built together. A small sound from nearby reminded them they weren't alone. Thomas had awakened and was watching them with sleepy curiosity. "Did you ask her?" "Pa?" The boy mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Matthew smiled, keeping one arm around Eleanor's waist. "I did, son. Miss Walsh has agreed to become Mrs. Harrison." Thomas nodded solemnly, as if this was precisely what he had expected. "Does that mean I'll call her Ma now?" The question, so innocent yet so profound, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She knelt before the boy, taking his small hands in hers. "That's entirely up to you, Thomas. You can continue calling me Miss Walsh, or Eleanor, if you prefer. Ma is a special name that belonged to your mother first. I would be honored if someday you felt comfortable using it for me as well, but there's no hurry and no obligation." Thomas considered this, his young face serious. "I think Ma would understand if I called you that too. She wouldn't want Pa and me to be alone forever." Matthew placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression tender. "Your mother wanted nothing but happiness for us, Thomas, and Eleanor brings us that happiness." The boy nodded decisively. "Then I think I'll call you. Not right away, but soon." He yawned widely. "Can we go home now? I miss my own bed." Matthew chuckled. "Yes, we can go home, all of us." In the days that followed, news of the engagement spread quickly through Oakridge. Most reactions were positive. The wealthy rancher and the resilient newcomer made a sensible match in frontier terms. Sarah was ecstatic, though also worried about replacing Eleanor at the cafe. "Don't fret," Eleanor assured her. "I'll help you find and train a new cook before the wedding, and even after I'm married, I can still assist." During busy times, Sarah hugged her tightly. "I'm losing an employee but gaining a sister. I'd say that's a fair trade." Not all reactions were as supportive. Mrs. Holloway made a point of commenting loudly in the general store that some women certainly know how to land on their feet, while Samuel Brooks was overheard at the saloon making crude jokes about Matthew's choice of bride. These barbs stung, but Eleanor refused to let them diminish her joy. Her life had taken an unexpected turn since arriving in Montana territory, but she couldn't regret the path that had led her to Matthew and Thomas. With the late summer season rapidly advancing, they decided on an October wedding after the fall. A cattle drive, but before winter weather made travel difficult. This would allow Matthew's distant relatives and business associates to attend if they wished. Nothing elaborate, Eleanor insisted when they discussed the plans. A simple ceremony, followed by a celebration with the community, Matthew agreed readily. The church, followed by a gathering at the ranch. We can clear the barn for dancing. As word spread beyond Oakridge, Eleanor was surprised to receive a letter from Boston. Mrs. Abernathy, her elderly former neighbor, wrote to express her delight at Eleanor's news. "I told you frontier men value substance over frippery," the old woman had written. "Your parents would be so proud to see you established with a good man who appreciates your worth." The letter reminded Eleanor that she had come to Montana with little beyond the contents of her trunk. While she had added a few simple garments to her wardrobe since arriving, she possessed nothing suitable for a bride. Sarah immediately offered a solution. "Mary's wedding dress is still in a trunk at the ranch. Matthew mentioned it once, said he couldn't bear to give it away after she died." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I couldn't possibly wear his first. Wife's gown. It wouldn't be appropriate." "Nonsense," Sarah countered. "In frontier communities, practical considerations often outweigh sentiment. Besides, Mary was built similarly to you, tall and substantial. Her dress might be one of the few that would fit without significant alterations. Still uncertain, Eleanor raised the subject hesitantly with Matthew that Sunday during their usual afternoon together. To her surprise, his face brightened at the suggestion. "I think it would be perfect," he said. Mary had no family to pass. Her things, too. She would have wanted her dress to be used and appreciated rather than sitting in a trunk gathering dust. "Are you certain?" Eleanor pressed. "I don't want to erase her memory." Matthew took her hands in his. "Eleanor, you've never tried to erase Mary. You've honored her memory and helped Thomas and me keep her in our hearts in a healthy way." He smiled gently. "Wearing her dress wouldn't diminish her. It would be a way of including her in our celebration." Thomas, who had been listening nearby as he played with the ranch dog, looked up. "Ma's dress was really pretty. She showed me a picture once. She looked like an angel in it. That settled the matter." The following week, Sarah accompanied Eleanor to the ranch while Matthew and Thomas were in town on business. Together, they opened the cedar trunk that contained Mary's carefully preserved wedding gown. The dress was simpler than current Eastern fashions, but beautifully made of ivory silk with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. When Eleanor held it against herself, it appeared to be a remarkably good fit, requiring only minor adjustments. "It's perfect," Sarah declared. "We'll take in the waist a bit and let out the bodice. No one will know it wasn't made for you." Eleanor ran her fingers over the delicate fabric. "I'll know, and I'll wear it with honor." As summer transitioned to autumn, preparations for the wedding accelerated. The community rallied around the couple, offering assistance with everything from food to decorations. Even Mrs. Peterson's 16-year-old daughter volunteered to play the church organ during the ceremony. One crisp September morning, as Eleanor was helping Sarah in the cafe, the door opened to reveal a familiar but unwelcome face. Samuel Brooks stood in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Miss Walsh," he greeted, removing his hat. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor exchanged a glance with Sarah, who positioned herself protectively nearby. "What can I do for you, Mr. Brooks?" Eleanor asked coolly. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "I was hoping we might speak privately." "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Sarah," Eleanor replied firmly. Samuel nodded reluctantly. "Very well," he cleared his throat. "I've come to apologize for my behavior when you first arrived in Oak Ridge. I treated you shamefully, and I've since come to regret it deeply." Eleanor studied his face, searching for sincerity. "What brings about this change of heart, Mr. Brooks?" "The fire," he admitted. "Harrison could have denied me water access for my cattle out of spite for how I treated you. Instead, he helped save my herd." He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "And then I saw how you kept this place running day and night, feeding the men fighting the fire, taking care of Harrison's boy. It showed a character I failed to recognize when we first met." The apology seemed genuine, if awkwardly delivered. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying so, Mr. Brooks. I accept your apology." Relief washed over Samuel's features. "I appreciate that, Miss Walsh. I also wanted to offer congratulations on your upcoming marriage. Harrison is a good man, better than I was to you." After Samuel departed, Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Well, that was unexpected." Eleanor smiled faintly. "People can surprise you, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better." As the wedding day approached, Eleanor found herself increasingly reflective about the journey that had brought her to this point. One evening, as she sat on the porch of the Double H with Matthew after Thomas had gone to bed, she shared these thoughts. "When I arrived in Oak Ridge, I thought my life was over," she admitted. "I'd staked everything on a future that disappeared the moment Samuel saw me. I felt worthless, humiliated." Matthew's hand found hers in the gathering dusk. "And now?" Now I understand that what felt like an ending was actually a beginning. If Samuel had married me, I would have been tied to a man who valued appearances over substance. Instead, I found you and Thomas, a real family based on love and respect. Matthew lifted her hand to his lips. We're the fortunate ones, Eleanor. You brought light back into our lives when we had resigned ourselves to shadows. 2 days before the wedding, disaster struck. A telegram arrived for Matthew from the cattle buyer in Helena. The fall sale would need to be delayed by 2 weeks due to an outbreak of illness in the city. I can't postpone the drive, Matthew explained gravely as they discussed the situation over dinner at the ranch. The cattle need to be moved to lower pastures before the first snow, and we need the income from the sale to get through the winter. Then, postpone the wedding, Eleanor suggested practically. We can marry when you return. Matthew shook his head. The minister is leaving for Billings the day after our scheduled ceremony. He won't return until late November. By then, mountain passes could be snowed in, preventing guests from attending. They sat in troubled silence until Thomas, who had been listening intently, offered a solution. Why don't you get married like you planned, and then Pa can go on the cattle drive the next day? You'll be Ma and Pa official-like, and then when Pa comes back, you can have a proper wedding night. His innocent suggestion brought color to both adults' cheeks, though the idea itself had merit. It's not how I envisioned beginning our marriage, Matthew admitted, but it might be the most practical solution. Eleanor nodded. A brief separation after the ceremony is preferable to a long postponement. We have the rest of our lives to be together after all. And so the plan was set. The wedding would proceed as scheduled, followed by a celebration at the ranch. The following morning, Matthew would depart with his ranch hands and the cattle, leaving Eleanor to move her belongings to the Double H and begin establishing herself as mistress of the household during his absence. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with aspen leaves shimmering gold against a brilliant blue sky. At the Double H, Sarah helped Eleanor prepare, styling her auburn hair into an elegant knot, adorned with small white flowers from Mary's garden. The dress, with Sarah's alterations, fit perfectly. The ivory silk complemented Eleanor's fair skin, while the classic styling flattered her generous figure. When she looked in the mirror, Eleanor barely recognized herself. Gone was the uncertain, humiliated woman who had arrived in Oak Ridge months earlier. In her place stood a confident bride, ready to embrace a future filled with promise. You look beautiful, Sarah said, blinking back tears. Truly beautiful. A knock at the bedroom door heralded Thomas, dressed in his Sunday best, his hair slicked. Down with water. Pa sent me to check if you're ready, he announced, then stopped short when he saw Eleanor. Wow! You look like a princess in a storybook. Eleanor laughed, tension easing from her shoulders. Thank you, Thomas. That's quite a compliment. Pa's nervous, the boy confided. He changed his shirt 3 times and kept pacing by the window. The thought of steady, unflappable Matthew Harrison, feeling anxious about their wedding, touched Eleanor deeply. Tell your father I'm ready whenever he is. Matthew had arranged for a buggy decorated with autumn flowers to transport Eleanor to the church, with Thomas proudly serving as escort. As they drove through town, people emerged from homes and businesses to wave and call congratulations. The small church was filled to capacity. Eleanor paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Wildflowers decorating the simple pews, sunlight streaming through the windows, and at the altar, Matthew waiting for her, his expression transforming from anxiety to wonder as their eyes met. With no father to give her away, Eleanor had asked Sheriff Miller to escort her down the aisle, a choice that honored the community that had become her new family. The older man offered his arm with dignity, his weathered face beaming with pride. "Ready, Miss Walsh," he whispered. Eleanor nodded, her gaze never leaving Matthew. "I've been ready since the moment we met," she replied softly. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish one another through all of life's joys and sorrows. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration at the Double H lasted well into the evening. The barn had been transformed with lanterns and autumn foliage, creating a rustic but magical setting for dancing and feasting. Nearly everyone from Oakridge attended, plus ranchers, and their families from miles around. Eleanor danced first with her new husband, then with Thomas, and finally with what seemed like every man in the county. Even Samuel Brooks approached to offer congratulations, though he kept a respectful distance from Matthew while doing so. As the night drew to a close, guests began to depart, leaving behind well wishes and gifts, practical items for the household, and a few treasured luxuries that were difficult to obtain on the frontier. Finally, only the closest friends and family remained. Sarah hugged Eleanor tightly before departing with her husband. "I'll come help you settle in properly after Matthew leaves tomorrow," she promised. When the last guest had gone, Matthew, Eleanor, and Thomas stood together on the porch of what was now truly their home. The boy yawned widely. The excitement of the day catching up with him. "Off to bed with you," Matthew told him gently. "Tomorrow will come early for all of us." Thomas hugged Eleanor impulsively. "Good night, Ma," he said, testing the word cautiously. Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion as she returned the embrace. "Good night, Thomas. Sleep well." After the boy had gone inside, Matthew turned to his new wife. "I'm sorry about tomorrow," he said quietly. "Leaving you so soon after the wedding isn't how I wanted to start our marriage." Eleanor placed her hand on his cheek. "It's only a temporary separation. We have a lifetime ahead of us." Matthew covered her hand with his own. "When I return, we'll have a proper beginning," he promised. "For now, may I at least kiss my bride under the stars?" Eleanor smiled as Matthew drew her into his arms. Their kiss was both a culmination of the journey that had brought them together and a promise of the path that stretched before them. A path they would walk side by side, through whatever challenges the frontier might present. Above them, the Montana sky blazed with stars, silent witnesses to a love that had blossomed from the most unlikely of beginnings. Dawn broke cold and clear the morning after the wedding. Eleanor awoke in the guest bedroom, where she had spent her first night as Mrs. Harrison, the gold band on her finger still feeling strange and new. From downstairs came the sounds of activity, men preparing for the cattle drive, boots on wooden floors, the clatter of coffee cups, and Matthew's deep voice giving instructions. She dressed quickly in a practical work dress and pinned her hair in a simple bun before descending to the kitchen. The room fell silent as she entered, half a dozen ranch hands pausing mid-conversation to nod respectfully. "Morning, Mrs. Harrison," one older cowboy greeted, touching his hat brim. "Good morning, gentlemen," Eleanor replied with a warm smile. "Please, continue your breakfast. You have a long journey ahead." She moved confidently to the stove, where she began preparing additional biscuits to supplement the meal Sarah had delivered earlier. Matthew entered from outside, his expression brightening when he saw her. "There's my bride," he said quietly, coming to her side. "You didn't need to be up so early." "Of course I did," Eleanor replied. "Did you think I would lie in bed while my husband prepares to leave?" She kept her voice light, though the thought of his departure weighed heavily. After the men had eaten their fill and moved outside to make final preparations, Matthew drew Eleanor into the privacy of his study. "I've left detailed instructions for Thomas about his chores," he told her, "and Jenkins will remain behind to help with the heavier ranch work. He knows to follow your directions as he would mine." Eleanor nodded. "We'll manage fine, Matthew. Don't worry about us." Matthew took her hands in his. "I should be gone in 3 weeks, 4 at most. If the passes start to snow in, we'll push harder to return quickly." His expression grew serious. "I've never left the ranch for so long since Mary died. It feels strange to go, especially now when our marriage has barely begun. It's what needs to be done, Eleanor said practically, though her heart ached at the thought of such a separation so soon after their wedding. The cattle drive is essential for the ranch's survival, and that means our family's survival too. Matthew pulled her into a fierce embrace. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against her hair. "You deserve every happiness," Eleanor replied, clinging to him for a moment before stepping back. "Now go say goodbye to your son. He's trying very hard to be brave about your leaving." Thomas waited on the porch, his young face solemn as he watched the cowboys readying their horses and checking supplies. Matthew knelt before him, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. "You're the man of the house while I'm gone," he said seriously. "I'm counting on you to help your mother settle in and keep things running smoothly." Thomas nodded, standing a little straighter. "I will, Pa. I promise. Mind what she tells you, and don't forget your chores." Matthew pulled his son into a hug. "I'll be back before you know it." Eleanor stood in the doorway, her throat tight with emotion as she witnessed the exchange. When Matthew turned to her for their final goodbye, she summoned a brave smile. "Safe journey," she whispered as he kissed her one last time. "Take care." "Of our home," he replied, "and yourself." Eleanor and Thomas stood side by side on the porch, waving as Matthew and his men rode away, driving the large herd of cattle before them. They remained there long after the dust had settled and the distant figures had disappeared over the horizon. Finally, Thomas looked up at Eleanor. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice small. Eleanor took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Now we get to work. This ranch won't run itself, and we need to make your father proud when he returns." She smiled down at the boy. "Are you with me, Thomas?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Yes, Ma." The word, spoken without hesitation for the first time, gave Eleanor the strength she needed. She was no longer just Eleanor Walsh, the abandoned mail-order bride. She was Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, mistress of the Double H Ranch and mother to a brave young boy who needed her to be strong. The first week of Matthew's absence passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor threw herself into learning every aspect of running the household, from managing supplies to overseeing the remaining ranch hands. Sarah visited, as promised, helping Eleanor reorganize the kitchen to her liking and offering advice on managing the accounts. "Matthew keeps everything in this ledger," Sarah explained, showing Eleanor a thick book filled with Matthew's meticulous handwriting. "Income from cattle sales, expenses for the ranch, household accounts, it's all here." Eleanor studied the pages with interest. Her father had taught her basic bookkeeping for their boarding house, skills that would serve her well as the rancher's wife. Thomas proved to be an invaluable guide, proudly showing Eleanor around the ranch and explaining the purpose of various buildings and equipment. He took his responsibility as man of the house seriously, diligently completing his chores each day without being reminded. In the evenings, they established a new routine. After dinner, they would sit by the fire while Eleanor read aloud from Thomas's adventure book. These quiet moments became a cherished time for both of them, strengthening the bond between stepmother and son. "Did you do this with your ma?" Thomas asked one night as Eleanor closed the book. "Read together?" "No," Eleanor replied honestly. "My mother couldn't read English very well. She spoke mainly Irish Gaelic, but she told wonderful stories from the old country, tales of fairies and heroes and ancient kings." Thomas considered this. "Could you tell me one of those stories sometime?" Eleanor smiled, touched by his interest. "I'd like that very much." The second week brought unexpected challenges. A cold snap descended on the region, sending temperatures plummeting and forcing Eleanor to manage the ranch through the first frost of the season. Jenkins, the ranch hand Matthew had left behind, proved his worth by helping secure the property against the cold, but even he looked concerned as grey clouds gathered ominously on the northern horizon. "Don't like the look of that sky, Mrs. Harrison," he commented as they finished securing the barn doors. "Could be an early snow coming." Eleanor gazed at the threatening clouds. Would that cause problems for Mr. Harrison and the cattle drive? Jenkins nodded grimly. If it snows heavily in the mountain passes, they could be delayed getting back, might even have to find shelter and wait it out if it's bad enough. That night, after Thomas was asleep, Eleanor sat alone by the fire, anxiety gnawing at her. What if Matthew was caught in a blizzard? What if he couldn't make it home for weeks? She had promised to manage in his absence, but the thought of facing the harsh Montana winter without him was daunting. She picked up the family Bible that sat on the mantelpiece, seeking comfort in its familiar words. As she opened it, a folded piece of paper fell out. Curious, Eleanor unfolded it to find a letter written in a delicate, feminine hand. "My dearest Matthew," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone from this world, and you are facing life without me." Eleanor realized with a start that she was reading a letter from Mary to her husband, likely written during her pregnancy when she sensed the danger ahead. Her first instinct was to refold it and return it to the Bible unread, but a line caught her eye. "I know you, my love. You will blame yourself for not saving me, and you will build walls around your heart to prevent further pain. But I urge you not to walk that lonely path." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she continued reading Mary's final message to her husband, a message of love, forgiveness, and hope for his future. "Find happiness again, Matthew. Find someone who will love you and Thomas as I have. Someone strong enough for frontier life, but gentle enough to heal your wounded heart. When you find her, love her without reservation or guilt. Know that you have my blessing." The letter ended with a simple signature: "All my love, Mary." Eleanor carefully refolded the letter and returned it to the Bible, her heart full. She had received an unexpected gift, the explicit blessing of the woman whose place she had taken, whose dress she had worn, whose son now called her Ma. When she finally went to bed, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would face whatever challenges arose in Matthew's absence, proving herself worthy of both his trust and Mary's blessing. The predicted snow arrived 2 days later, not as the feared blizzard, but as a steady fall that blanketed the ranch in white. Thomas was delighted, running outside to play in the first snowfall of the season. Eleanor watched from the porch, smiling at his childish enthusiasm despite her concerns about Matthew's journey. That afternoon, they received unexpected visitors. Sheriff Miller arrived with Samuel Brooks, both men looking grave. "Mrs. Harrison," the sheriff greeted, removing his hat. "Sorry to trouble you, but we've got a situation in town. The snow caused the creek to rise, and we're concerned about flooding near the lower streets. We're gathering all available men to help with sandbagging." "Jenkins can certainly go with you," Eleanor offered immediately. "Actually, Ma'am," Samuel said, "we were hoping young Thomas might be able to help too. We need nimble hands to carry messages between work crews, and he knows the town well." Eleanor hesitated, protective instincts flaring. Thomas was Matthew's son, her responsibility in his absence. Yet she could see the boy's eager expression. This was a chance for him to contribute to the community, to be treated as more than a child. "I can do it, Ma," Thomas said earnestly. "Pa would want me to help." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Very well. But you'll wear your warmest clothes and come home at sunset, no arguments. Jenkins can bring you back." As the men and Thomas prepared to leave, Samuel lingered behind for a moment. "We'll take good care of the boy, Mrs. Harrison. You have my word." "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," Eleanor replied, somewhat surprised by his considerate behavior, further evidence of the change she had observed in him since his apology. With Jenkins and Thomas gone, Eleanor found herself truly alone at the double, H for the first time. The large house seemed unnervingly quiet as darkness fell and the snow continued to accumulate. She busied herself with chores, preparing a hearty stew that would be ready whenever Thomas and Jenkins returned. The hours passed, and sunset came and went with no sign of them. Eleanor tried to remain calm, telling herself that the flood prevention efforts had simply taken longer than expected. But as full darkness descended and the snow intensified, her worry grew into genuine fear. Finally, unable to bear the waiting any longer, Eleanor made a decision. She dressed in her warmest clothes, lit a lantern, and saddled Buttercup, the gentlest of the horses Matthew had left behind. Her experience with horses was limited. In Boston, she had rarely had occasion to ride, but necessity drove her to overcome her hesitation. The journey into Oakridge was slow and treacherous. The snow had deepened considerably, and Buttercup picked her way carefully along the barely visible trail. Eleanor's hands grew numb despite her gloves, and the biting wind cut through her heavy coat. But concern for Thomas propelled her forward. As she approached town, Eleanor could see unusual activity despite the late hour. Lanterns bobbed along the creek bank, and voices called back and forth as men worked to reinforce a hastily constructed barrier of sandbags. Eleanor dismounted awkwardly, tying Buttercup to a hitching post before making her way toward the activity. Sheriff Miller spotted her first, his expression registering surprise. "Mrs. Harrison, what in heaven's name are you doing out in this weather?" "Thomas didn't come home," she explained, her voice tight with worry. "Where is he?" The sheriff's face grew serious. "He was helping at the south end of town last I saw." Brooks was supervising that section. Eleanor immediately headed in that direction, her boots sinking into the deepening snow. She found Samuel directing a group of men as they stacked sandbags against a rapidly rising section of creek. "Mr. Brooks," she called, struggling to be heard over the wind and the men's efforts. "Where is Thomas?" Samuel turned, shock evident on his face. "Mrs. Harrison, the boy left over an hour ago. Jenkins took him home when the work got too dangerous for youngsters." Eleanor's heart seemed to stop. They never arrived. A grim understanding passed between them. Either Jenkins and Thomas had encountered trouble on the trail, or worse, they had missed the trail entirely in the worsening snow. A potentially fatal mistake in the frigid Montana night. "We need to organize a search party," Samuel said immediately, taking charge of the situation. "Miller!" he shouted to the sheriff. "Harrison's boy and Jenkins are missing between town and the Double H." Within minutes, a group of volunteers had assembled, including several of Matthew's neighbors who had come to help with the flooding. Eleanor insisted on joining the search despite their protests. "He's my son," she stated firmly, silencing their objections with the conviction in her voice. "I won't wait at home while he's lost in this storm." They set out in groups of 3, each taking different sections of the trail between town and the ranch. Eleanor rode with Samuel and another rancher named Peterson, her lantern held high as they called Thomas's name into the swirling snow. The temperature continued to drop as midnight approached. Eleanor's fear grew with each passing minute. Her mind conjuring terrible images of Thomas lying injured or frozen in a snowdrift. What would she tell Matthew if something happened to his son while under her care? "There!" Samuel suddenly shouted, pointing to a dark shape ahead that didn't match the surrounding landscape. As they drew closer, Eleanor's lantern illuminated an overturned wagon half buried in snow. Jenkins lay nearby, conscious but clearly injured, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Where's Thomas?" Eleanor demanded, dropping to her knees beside the ranch hand. "Took shelter," Jenkins managed through chattering teeth. Told him, old Miller cabin, quarter-mile east. Told him, stay put, I'd get help. Samuel immediately took charge. Peterson, get Jenkins back to town. Mrs. Harrison and I will find the boy. Eleanor was already remounting her horse, pointing it eastward. The old Miller place was abandoned years ago, Samuel explained as they rode. Roof's probably half caved in by now, but it's better than nothing in this storm. They found the cabin exactly where Jenkins had indicated, a dilapidated structure barely visible through the driving snow. Eleanor was off her horse before it had fully stopped, rushing to the sagging door. "Thomas!" she called, pushing her way inside. "Thomas, are you here?" For one terrible moment, there was no response. Then, from a dark corner came a small voice. "Ma, is that you?" Eleanor's lantern revealed Thomas huddled beneath a pile of old sacking, his face pale with cold but very much alive. She dropped to her knees beside him, gathering him into her arms with a sob of relief. "You came for me," Thomas whispered, burying his face against her shoulder. "I knew you would." "Of course I came," Eleanor replied, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I will always come for you, Thomas. Always." Samuel appeared in the doorway, his expression softening at the sight of their reunion. "We need to get you both." "And back to the ranch," he said. "This storm's getting worse by the minute." With Thomas bundled securely in front of her on Buttercup, Eleanor followed Samuel through the blinding snow. The journey seemed interminable, but finally the welcome shape of the Double H loomed before them. Once inside, Eleanor quickly built up the fire while Samuel tended to the horses. Thomas, wrapped in blankets by the hearth, watched them with exhausted eyes. "You should get back to town before the trail becomes impassable," Eleanor told Samuel as he returned from the stable. Samuel glanced out the window at the worsening storm. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Harrison, but I don't think that's wise. This blizzard set in for the night. If you've no objection, I'd be safer waiting it out here." Eleanor nodded her agreement. "Of course, I'll prepare the guest room." After settling Thomas in his bed, Eleanor returned downstairs to find Samuel stoking the fire. The awkwardness of their situation, her former fiancé staying under the roof she now shared with Matthew, was not lost on either of them. "I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Brooks," Eleanor said quietly, "for helping find Thomas." Samuel looked up, his expression surprisingly gentle. "No debt owed, Mrs. Harrison. I'm just glad the boy's safe." He hesitated. "You know, when I first met you at that train station, I made a terrible judgment based on appearances alone. I couldn't see past—" He gestured vaguely. "My size," Eleanor supplied calmly. Samuel had the grace to look ashamed. "Yes, but tonight I saw something else entirely. I saw a woman brave enough to ride out in a blizzard to find her stepson, a woman who commands respect without demanding it." He met her eyes directly. "Matthew Harrison is a fortunate man, Mrs. Harrison. Far more fortunate than I deserve to be." Eleanor accepted the compliment with a simple nod. "We should both get some rest, Mr. Brooks. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As she lay in bed later, listening to the howl of the wind outside, Eleanor reflected on the day's events. She had faced her fear and overcome it. She had proven, to Samuel, to the community, but most importantly to herself, that she was indeed capable of being the wife of a rancher and the mother of his son, even in the most challenging circumstances. Somewhere, out in that same storm, Matthew was making his way home to her. Eleanor prayed for his safety, but as she drifted towards sleep, she did so with newfound confidence. Whatever trials lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through this night. She was Eleanor Harrison now, and she had found her place in the world. The blizzard raged for 2 days, transforming the Montana landscape into an unbroken expanse of white. When the storm finally abated, the world outside the Double H was almost unrecognizable, with drifts piled high against the buildings and fences nearly buried beneath the snow. Samuel Brooks departed for town as soon as the trail was passable. promising to send word about Jenkins's condition and to alert the neighboring ranches that Thomas had been found safe. Eleanor watched him ride away with mixed emotions. Gratitude for his help during the crisis, but also a lingering unease at his presence in the home she now shared with Matthew. "Will Pa be able to get back through all this snow?" Thomas asked, standing beside her on the porch as Samuel's figure diminished in the distance. Eleanor put an arm around the boy's shoulders. "Your father is the most capable man I know. If anyone can find a way home through this, it's Matthew Harrison." Her confident words belied her private concerns. The cattle drive should have reached Helena before the worst of the storm, but the return journey would now be treacherous, with mountain passes likely blocked by snowdrifts. What if Matthew was forced to remain in Helena until spring? What if he attempted the journey anyway and encountered trouble? These worries remained unspoken as Eleanor and Thomas settled into a routine of ranch tasks made more difficult by the heavy snow. They shoveled paths to the barn and outbuildings, broke ice on the water troughs for the remaining livestock, and maintained a constant fire in the house against the penetrating cold. 5 days after the blizzard, Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Thomas burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Riders coming!" he shouted. "4 men on horseback from the East Trail." Eleanor's heart leapt with hope as she hastily wiped her hands on her apron. "Is it your father?" "Too far to tell yet," Thomas replied, already pulling on his coat. "But who else would it be in this weather?" They hurried outside, shielding their eyes against the glare of sunlight on snow as they strained to identify the approaching riders. Then Thomas gave a whoop of joy. "It's Pa! That's Thunderbolt in the lead. I'd know him anywhere." Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized Matthew's broad-shouldered silhouette. He was hunched slightly in the saddle, suggesting exhaustion, but unmistakably alive and home at last. Thomas could not contain himself, running down the cleared path toward the approaching riders, waving his arms wildly. Eleanor remained on the porch, suddenly conscious of her work dress and flour-dusted apron, wishing she had time to make herself more presentable for Matthew's return. But as the riders drew closer and Matthew's gaze found hers across the snowy distance, such concerns evaporated. His face, though weathered from the journey, lit with a smile that warmed her more effectively than any fire. The riders reached the yard, and Matthew dismounted with a weariness that spoke of long days in the saddle. He embraced Thomas first, lifting the boy off his feet in a bear hug. "You've grown 2 inches while I was gone," he teased, setting Thomas down. "Wait till you hear what happened, Pa," Thomas exclaimed. "There was a flood in town, and then me and Jenkins got caught in the blizzard, and Ma rode out in the storm. To find me!" Matthew's eyebrows rose as he looked to Eleanor for confirmation of this alarming summary of events. She gave a small nod, silently promising a more detailed explanation later. Then Matthew was mounting the porch steps, and Eleanor moved forward into his embrace. He held her tightly, the cold of his coat seeping through her dress, but his face was warm against her neck. "Welcome home," she whispered. "It's good to be home," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. After a moment he stepped back, keeping an arm around her waist as he addressed his men. "Get those horses stabled and warmed up, then come inside for hot food before you head to your cabins." As the hands led the horses toward the barn, Matthew turned back to Eleanor. "Now, what's this about you riding out in a blizzard?" Before she could answer, Thomas launched into an excited recounting of the entire adventure: the flooding creek, the overturned wagon, Jenkins's broken leg, the abandoned cabin, and Eleanor's midnight rescue mission with Samuel Brooks. Matthew listened with growing amazement, his grip on Eleanor's hand tightening at certain points in the tale. When Thomas paused for breath, Matthew shook his head in wonder. "It seems I've married a woman of extraordinary courage," he said, his eyes filled with admiration as he gazed at Eleanor. She flushed under his regard. "I did what any mother would do." The simple statement hung in the air between them, its significance not lost on either adult. In that moment of crisis, Eleanor had fully embraced her role as Thomas's mother, not just in name, but in the depth of her commitment to his welfare. Later, after the ranch hands had been fed and Thomas had finally been persuaded to go to bed, though only after extracting a promise from his father to tell him all about the cattle drive the next day, Matthew and Eleanor were at last alone in the parlor. "You must be exhausted," Eleanor said, noting the dark circles under Matthew's eyes and the way he winced slightly as he settled into his chair by the fire. "I've been riding since dawn for 3 days straight," he admitted. "We sold the cattle for a good price, but when the storm hit, I couldn't bear the thought of being stranded in Helena for weeks." He reached for her hand. "I needed to get home to you and Thomas." "I'm glad you're safe," Eleanor said softly. "We were worried." Matthew's thumb traced circles on her palm, a gesture becoming familiar and cherished. "Not as worried as I was when I heard about your midnight ride through a blizzard." His expression grew serious. "Eleanor, what you did was incredibly dangerous. If something had happened to you—" "Nothing happened," she assured him, "and I couldn't simply wait at home when Thomas was missing. He's my son now, too." Matthew's face softened. "Yes, he is. And he adores you." He hesitated. "Samuel Brooks helped you find him?" Eleanor nodded, understanding his complex feelings about the man who had first rejected her. "He was different, respectful. He stayed here during the worst of the storm. But in the guest room, of course." Matthew was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "I find myself in the unusual position of feeling grateful to a man I've previously had little respect for," he finally said. "It seems Brooks has more character than I gave him credit for." "People can surprise you," Eleanor replied, echoing her earlier observation to Sarah. "Sometimes for the better." Matthew studied her face in the firelight. "You've certainly surprised me, Eleanor Harrison. When I left a bride of one day behind, I worried constantly about how you would manage in my absence. I should have known better." "I had help," Eleanor demurred. "The community rallied around us during the storm." "Because they respect you," Matthew countered. "You've earned your place here, not just as my wife, but as a woman of substance and courage in your own right." He stood, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. "Which makes me all the more fortunate to call you my wife." His voice deepened. "My wife, in name only, thus far." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at his implication. "The guest room has been prepared for you," she said hesitantly. "I thought you might be too tired tonight." Matthew's hands gently framed her face. "I've ridden through snow and ice to return to you, Eleanor. Unless you wish otherwise, I have no intention of spending another night apart from my wife." Their first night together as husband and wife was everything Eleanor could have hoped for, tender, passionate, and filled with discoveries. Matthew's hands and lips mapped her body with reverent appreciation, dispelling any lingering doubts she might have harbored about her fuller figure. In his arms, Eleanor felt not merely accepted, but celebrated, her generous curves a source of his evident pleasure rather than disappointment. "You are beautiful," he whispered against her skin, his voice thick with desire, "every inch of you." Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Matthew shared stories of the cattle drive, the challenges they had faced, the unexpected assistance from other ranchers when the storm hit, the relief of completing the sale successfully despite the complications. "The money will see us through the winter comfortably," he told her, "and we can make some improvements to the ranch come spring." "What kind of improvements?" Eleanor asked, her head pillowed on his chest. "I was thinking of an addition to the house," Matthew replied, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Another bedroom or two." Eleanor propped herself up to look at him. "Are you planning to take in boarders, Mr. Harrison?" Matthew smiled, pulling her back into his embrace. "I was thinking more along the lines of filling those rooms with children of our own," he said softly. Brothers and sisters for Thomas. The casual mention of a shared future, of children born of their love, filled Eleanor with a happiness she had never dared to imagine when she first stepped off that train in Oakridge. Winter settled in earnest over the Double H Ranch. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the temperature plummeted to levels Eleanor had never experienced in Boston. But the harsh conditions only served to bring the small family closer together. Their evenings developed a comfortable pattern. Dinner together, followed by Thomas's lessons at the kitchen table under Eleanor's guidance. Then stories by the fire before the boy reluctantly went to bed. Afterward, Matthew and Eleanor would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the companionable silence as she sewed and he whittled or read. And each night they retired to their shared bedroom, where they explored the physical aspect of their marriage with increasing confidence and mutual pleasure. December arrived with preparations for Christmas, the first Eleanor would celebrate as part of a family since her parents died. She threw herself into creating special traditions that honored both Matthew's established customs and new ones she brought from her own background. In Boston, my mother always made plum pudding for Christmas dinner, she told Thomas, as they collected pine boughs to decorate the house, and my father would hide small gifts around the house for me to find on Christmas morning. Can we do that? Thomas asked eagerly. The hidden gifts? If your father approves, Eleanor replied with a smile. Matthew not only approved, but embraced all of Eleanor's suggestions enthusiastically. Christmas was Mary's favorite holiday, he explained one evening as they sat alone by the fire. After she died, I did the minimum for Thomas's sake, but I couldn't recapture the joy of the season. He squeezed her hand. Thank you for bringing that back to our home. On Christmas Eve, they attended a special service at the church in town. The small building was packed with families from Oakridge and the surrounding ranches, everyone dressed in their finest clothes despite the bitter cold outside. Eleanor sat between Matthew and Thomas, singing carols with a full heart, overwhelmed by how completely her life had transformed in less than a year. From the lonely spinster caring for aging parents in Boston to a beloved wife and mother in Montana Territory, the journey had been neither easy nor straightforward, but she wouldn't change a moment of it. After the service, as they mingled with neighbors in the churchyard, Eleanor noticed Samuel Brooks watching them from a distance. When their eyes met, he nodded respectfully before turning away to speak with another rancher. He's been different since the night of the blizzard, Eleanor remarked to Matthew as they drove home in the sleigh. Almost as if that experience changed something fundamental in him. Matthew considered this. Perhaps seeing you risk everything for Thomas made him realize what he missed by judging you so superficially. He shook his head. His loss, my gain, though I'm not inclined to thank him for being a fool. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with sunlight sparkling on the snow-covered landscape. Thomas woke at first light, bursting into their bedroom, with childish excitement that made both adults laugh. Can I look for the hidden gifts now, please? The day unfolded in a series of perfect moments. Thomas's delight at finding small treasures hidden throughout the house, the exchange of thoughtful gifts between the three of them, a Christmas dinner that combined Eleanor's Boston traditions with frontier practicalities. That evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, Matthew presented Eleanor with one final gift, a small, carefully wrapped package. I was saving this for a private moment, he explained, as she unwrapped it. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When Eleanor opened it, she found a tiny portrait of Thomas on one side. The other side was empty. For our first child, Matthew explained, his voice husky with emotion. When the time comes. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she clutched the locket to her heart. "It's perfect," she whispered. Matthew helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers lingering on the sensitive skin below her ear. "I have something else to tell you," he said, guiding her to sit beside him on the sofa. "I received a letter from my brother James yesterday. He and his family are planning to visit in the spring." Eleanor tensed slightly. "Your brother who lives in St. Louis? The successful businessman?" Matthew nodded, noting her reaction. "You're worried about meeting them?" It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "A little," she admitted. "From what you've told me, your brother's wife is very particular, very fashionable." "Catherine can be somewhat conventional in her views," Matthew acknowledged. "But her opinion doesn't matter to me, Eleanor. You're my wife, the mistress of this home, and Thomas's mother in every way that counts." Eleanor appreciated his support, but the prospect of meeting Matthew's relatives, the only family he had besides Thomas, was intimidating nonetheless. Would they look at her and see what Samuel Brooks had initially seen? Would they judge Matthew for choosing a wife who didn't fit society's narrow definition of beauty? "Stop worrying," Matthew said softly, reading her expression. "You've won over an entire town that initially viewed you as the abandoned mail-order bride. You've earned the respect of hardened cowboys and frontier women. You rode into a blizzard to save our son." He kissed her gently. "My brother and his family will adore you, just as Thomas and I do." As January gave way to February, Eleanor found herself making frequent trips to the outhouse, battling waves of nausea that seemed particularly intense in the mornings. At first, she attributed the symptoms to the rich holiday foods, or perhaps a mild winter illness. But as weeks passed and the pattern continued, a different explanation began to take shape in her mind. She waited until she was certain before sharing her suspicion with Matthew. One evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, she joined her husband in his study, where he was reviewing the ranch accounts. "Matthew," she began, her voice soft with wonder, "I believe I'm carrying your child." Matthew looked up sharply, his pen frozen mid-stroke. "Eleanor." His voice was barely audible, filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She nodded, her hands unconsciously cradling her still flat abdomen. "I've missed my monthly courses twice now, and I've been feeling different. I remember how my mother described it when she was expecting the baby she lost before me." Matthew was on his feet instantly, crossing to where she stood and dropping to his knees before her. He placed his large, calloused hands reverently over hers. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Eleanor had feared, briefly, that Matthew might be concerned about her age. At 27, she was older than many first-time mothers. But the joy radiating from his face dispelled any such worries. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Matthew looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Beyond words," he replied. "When I lost Mary, I thought that part of my life was over. Then you came into our world, bringing light and warmth back to this house." His hands tightened gently over hers. "And now you're giving us the greatest gift imaginable, a new life created from our love." He rose to his feet, drawing her into a tender embrace. "Have I told you today how much I love you, Eleanor Harrison?" "You have," she murmured against his chest, "but I never tire of hearing it." That night, as they lay together in their bed, Matthew's hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect happiness. She had traveled west as a mail-order bride, seeking a practical arrangement to secure her future. Instead, fate had led her to true love through an unexpected path of rejection and redemption. The humiliation she had experienced at the Oak Ridge train station, which had once seemed like the worst moment of her life, had actually been the first step toward the greatest joy she had ever known. Outside, snow fell softly in the Montana night, blanketing the Double H Ranch in pristine white. But inside, wrapped in her husband's arms with their unborn child nestled safely beneath her heart, Eleanor Harrison had never felt warmer or more at home. Spring arrived on the Montana frontier, with a gentle persistence that gradually transformed the snow-covered landscape. Meadows emerged from beneath their white blankets, revealing tender green shoots. Creeks swelled with melting snow, their currents swift and musical. The Double H Ranch awakened from its winter slumber, with newborn calves wobbling beside their mothers in the pastures. Eleanor watched these changes from the porch, her hand resting on the slight swell of her abdomen, now visible beneath her loosened dresses. At 4 months along, her pregnancy was progressing well, though morning sickness had persisted longer than she had expected. Dr. Wilson from Oak Ridge, who visited monthly to check on her condition, assured her that this was not uncommon. Every woman experiences pregnancy differently, he explained during his April visit. But you're healthy and strong, Mrs. Harrison. I foresee no complications. Matthew had become endearingly protective, insisting that Eleanor rest frequently and hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier household tasks. Thomas, initially confused by the news that he would have a sibling, had gradually warmed to the idea, peppering Eleanor with questions about the baby and when it would arrive. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" he asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Matthew and the hands move cattle to the spring pasture. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Eleanor explained. "But either way, you'll be a wonderful big brother." Thomas considered this seriously. "I think I'd like a brother," he decided, "but a sister would be all right too, I guess." Eleanor smiled, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Very generous of you." The boy leaned against her side, his expression turning thoughtful. "Will the baby call you Ma, like I do now?" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "And the baby will call your father Pa, just like you do." Thomas nodded, satisfying some private question in his mind. "And will you love the baby the same as you love me, even though I'm not really yours?" The question caught Eleanor by surprise, revealing an insecurity she hadn't realized the boy harbored. She turned to face him directly, taking his small hands in hers. "Thomas James Harrison, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You became my son the moment I married your father, and I have loved you as my own from that day forward. This new baby doesn't change that in the slightest." She squeezed his hands. "A mother's heart isn't divided when she has more than one child. It simply grows larger to hold all the love needed." The boy's expression brightened. "Like when Pa built the new corral? He didn't take down the old one, he just made more space for the new calves." Eleanor laughed at the practical comparison. "Exactly like that." As May approached, bringing warmer days and wildflowers dotting the prairie, preparations began for the long-anticipated visit from Matthew's brother James and his family. They would be arriving on the first train in June, staying for 2 weeks before continuing their journey to San Francisco. Despite Matthew's reassurances, Eleanor felt increasingly nervous about the visit. She had never been particularly concerned about fashion or society's approval, but these were Matthew's only living relatives. Their opinion mattered, even if he claimed otherwise. "What if they think you married beneath you?" she asked one night as they lay in bed, her worries spilling over. "Your brother is a successful banker. His wife probably attends fancy balls and tea parties. And here I am, a former mail-order bride, who works in a cafe with no fashionable clothes or refined manners." Matthew propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with a mixture of tenderness and exasperation. "Eleanor, when will you understand? You're worth a dozen society women with their corsets and calling cards." His hand gently caressed the curve of her stomach. "You're carrying our child. You've made a genuine home for Thomas and me. You rode into a blizzard to find our son when he was lost." He shook his head. "If James or Catherine says one word that causes you pain, they'll find themselves on the next train east, family or not." His fierce protectiveness soothed her fears somewhat, though she still spent the following weeks ensuring the house was immaculate, planning elaborate meals, and using fabric ordered from the general store to sew new curtains for the guest room. One afternoon in late May, Eleanor was in town purchasing supplies when she encountered Mrs. Holloway outside the general store. The older woman, who had been Eleanor's first landlady and later one of her most vocal critics, eyed her pregnant figure with undisguised interest. "Well, Mrs. Harrison, it seems congratulations are in order," she remarked, her tone difficult to interpret. "You've certainly secured your position quickly." The implication that Eleanor had deliberately gotten pregnant to cement her place in Matthew's life was clear. 6 months earlier, such an insinuation would have left Eleanor flustered and hurt. Now, she merely smiled serenely. "Yes, Matthew, and I are very blessed," she replied, her hand resting protectively over her bump. "We're looking forward to welcoming another child into our family. Thomas is quite excited to be a big brother." Mrs. Holloway seemed disappointed by Eleanor's composed response. "I understand Matthew's brother and his wife are visiting next month. From St. Louis, I hear. Very wealthy, very refined." "Yes, we're looking forward to their visit," Eleanor said pleasantly. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Holloway, I need to finish my shopping. Good day." As she continued down the street, Eleanor realized that the woman's attempts to undermine her confidence no longer had power. She had proven herself to Matthew, to Thomas, to the community, and most importantly, to herself. The opinions of people like Mrs. Holloway simply didn't matter anymore. The Harrison family arrived on the first Tuesday in June, disembarking from the train with an impressive array of luggage. James Harrison resembled his brother physically, tall and broad-shouldered, though softer around the middle from his less active lifestyle. His wife, Catherine, was exactly as Eleanor had imagined, slender, fashionably dressed, with an assessing gaze that took in everything. Their children, Amelia, 14, and Robert, 12, stood beside them, clearly tired from the long journey, and uncertain about this rural setting so different from their city home. Eleanor and Matthew greeted them at the station, with Thomas bouncing excitedly beside them. "James!" Matthew embraced his brother warmly. "It's been too long." "Far too long," James agreed, returning the embrace before turning to Eleanor. "And this must be the bride Thomas wrote about so enthusiastically in his letters." Eleanor extended her hand, acutely aware of Catherine's eyes cataloguing her practical dress, her work-roughened hands, and her obviously pregnant figure. "It's a pleasure to meet you all at last. Matthew and Thomas have told me so much about you." To her surprise, James ignored her outstretched hand and instead pulled her into a gentle hug. "Welcome to the family, Eleanor. I'm delighted my brother finally found happiness again." Catherine stepped forward, her expression warming slightly. "Indeed, when we received Matthew's letter about your marriage, we were thrilled. Mary's loss hit him so hard, we worried he might never open his heart again." The genuine welcome from both James and Catherine eased much of Eleanor's anxiety. By the time they arrived at the Double H Ranch, where Eleanor had prepared a substantial welcome meal, the initial formality had given way to more comfortable family interactions. Over the following days, Eleanor observed that while Catherine was indeed fashion-conscious and more refined in her manners, she was also practical and unpretentious. She happily rolled up her sleeves to help with household tasks and showed genuine interest in Eleanor's experiences adapting to frontier life. "I don't know how you manage," Catherine remarked one morning as they prepared breakfast together. "St. Louis seems primitive compared to Boston sometimes, but this She gestured toward the view outside the kitchen window, where the vast Montana landscape stretched to the horizon. "This is truly wilderness." "It was overwhelming at first," Eleanor admitted, "but there's a freedom here that I never experienced in Boston. Room to breathe, to become who you truly are without society's constraints." Catherine studied her thoughtfully. "I can see why Matthew loves you. You have a strength that Mary lacked for all her sweetness." "You knew her well?" Eleanor asked. Catherine nodded. "We grew up together in St. Louis. She was gentle, creative, devoted to Matthew, and later to Thomas. But frontier life terrified her. She endured it because she loved Matthew, but she never embraced it as you clearly have." This insight into her predecessor touched Eleanor deeply. It explained Matthew's occasional protective hovering. He had loved a woman who needed that protection, who had been gradually worn down by the harsh realities of frontier life. "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor said softly. "She would have liked you," Catherine replied with certainty, "especially seeing how happy you've made Matthew and Thomas." As the visit progressed, the two families grew increasingly comfortable with one another. James and Matthew spent long days riding the ranch, reconnecting through shared work and memories. Thomas proudly showed his cousins his favorite spots around the property, gradually drawing the initially reluctant city children into exploring the natural wonders of the ranch. Eleanor found herself particularly connecting with young Amelia, who was at that difficult age between childhood and womanhood. The girl confided her frustrations with the restrictions placed on her in St. Louis society and her secret desire to become a teacher. "Father expects me to make a good marriage, like my mother," she confessed one afternoon as they gathered wildflowers near the creek. "But I want something more before I settle down." "Have you told your parents about your interest in teaching?" Eleanor asked. Amelia shook her head. "Mother might understand, but Father believes education is wasted on girls who will only end up as wives and mothers anyway." Eleanor considered this. "Would you like me to speak with your father? Sometimes these things are easier coming from another adult." The girl's eyes widened. "Would you really?" "Of course," Eleanor assured her. "Everyone deserves the chance to pursue their dreams, Amelia, even girls who will eventually become wives and mothers." The opportunity came later that week, when Eleanor found herself alone with James, while the others had gone fishing at the lake. She broached the subject carefully, framing Amelia's desire for education as an asset to her future family rather than a distraction from it. "An educated mother raises educated children," she pointed out, "and teaching experience would only enhance Amelia's natural gifts with young people. I've watched her with Thomas. She has a patient, nurturing quality that would serve her well." In a classroom, James listened thoughtfully, less dismissive than Amelia had feared. "Catherine has said similar things," he admitted. "Perhaps I've been too traditional in my thinking." He studied Eleanor with newfound respect. "You're quite persuasive, Eleanor. I see now why you've had such a positive influence on my brother and nephew." The conversation shifted to Eleanor's own journey, how she had come west as a mail-order bride, only to be rejected by her intended husband. "Samuel Brooks," James mused. "The name sounds familiar. Didn't Matthew mention him in connection with some incident this past winter?" Eleanor nodded, sharing the story of the blizzard and Samuel's assistance in finding Thomas. "People can change," she concluded. "Sometimes they just need the right circumstances to reveal their better nature, or the right person to bring it out in them," James suggested. "It seems you have a gift for that, Eleanor." The day before the Harrison family was scheduled to depart, a surprise visitor arrived at the ranch. Samuel Brooks rode up to the house, looking uncharacteristically nervous as he dismounted. Matthew met him in the yard, his posture initially wary. "Brooks, what brings you out this way?" Samuel removed his hat. "Harrison, I heard your brother and his family were visiting from back east. I've come on business that might interest him." Intrigued, Matthew invited Samuel inside, where introductions were made. Eleanor watched with curiosity as the two men settled in. Matthew's study with James, the door closing behind them. An hour later they emerged, all three looking pleased with whatever had been discussed. Samuel declined Eleanor's offer of refreshment, citing other business in the area, but he paused before leaving to address her directly. "Mrs. Harrison, you're looking well. Motherhood clearly agrees with you." "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," Eleanor replied, genuine in her response despite their complicated history. After Samuel departed, James explained the purpose of his visit. Brooks is organizing a consortium of local ranchers to build a proper stockyard and small slaughterhouse in Oakridge. It would mean better prices for local beef and less dependency on the Helena buyers. He wanted investment capital, Matthew added, and James has agreed to consider it through his bank. "It's a sound business proposition," James confirmed. "And Brooks seems a capable man, despite what happened between him and Eleanor initially." After the Harrison family departed, with promises of future visits and an invitation for Eleanor, Matthew, and Thomas to come to St. Louis once the baby was old enough to travel, life at the Double H settled back into its familiar rhythm. Eleanor's pregnancy advanced, her body changing more dramatically as summer progressed. In early August, with her due date approaching, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. One evening, as she and Matthew sat on the porch watching the sunset, she shared these thoughts. "A year ago, I was preparing to leave Boston, full of anxiety about meeting a stranger who would become my husband," she mused. "I never imagined standing on that train platform being rejected would lead to all this happiness." Matthew took her, and, his expression tender. "When Mary died, I thought the best parts of my life were behind me. I focused on Thomas and the ranch, never expecting to find love again." His hand moved to rest on her rounded belly, where their child stirred beneath his palm. "You've given us both a second chance at family, at happiness." "We've given it to each other," Eleanor corrected gently. 2 weeks later, as a late summer thunderstorm rolled across the prairie, Eleanor went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, but Eleanor's strength and determination, the same qualities that had carried her through all the challenges of the past year, sustained her through the ordeal. At dawn, as the storm cleared and the first rays of sunlight penetrated the bedroom, Eleanor brought their daughter into the world. Matthew, who had remained by her side throughout the night despite tradition dictating that men wait elsewhere, was the first to hold the squalling infant after the midwife cleaned and swaddled her. "She's perfect," he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he placed the tiny bundle in Eleanor's arms. "Just like her mother." They named her Mary Grace Harrison, honoring both Matthew's first wife and the unexpected blessings that had brought them together. Thomas, aloud, in to meet his sister once Eleanor had rested, approached the bed with uncharacteristic shyness. "She's so small," he observed, peering at the infant's red, wrinkled face. "You were this small once too," Eleanor told him, shifting slightly to give him a better view. "Would you like to hold her?" The boy's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Can I?" Of course. Eleanor guided him into a sitting position beside her and carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support her head. "This is your sister, Thomas. She's going to look up to you her whole life." Thomas stared down at the infant with wonder. "Hello, Mary," he whispered. "I'm your big brother." He looked up at Eleanor, his expression serious. "I'll always protect her, Ma. I promise." "I know you will," Eleanor replied, blinking back tears, as she met Matthew's gaze over their son's head. In that moment, with her husband and son beside her and her newborn daughter in Thomas's careful embrace, Eleanor felt the circle of her life complete itself. The lonely woman who had stepped off the train in Oakridge, only to face humiliation and rejection, had found something far more precious than what she had originally sought. She had found a home where she was valued, not despite her differences, but because of the strength and love those differences represented. She had found a family bound together not by obligation, but by choice and deep affection. She had found a community where she belonged, respected for her contributions and her character, and most importantly, she had found love, not the practical arrangement she had traveled west expecting, but a profound connection that had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. As if sensing her mother's thoughts, baby Mary made a small sound, her tiny fingers curling reflexively around Thomas's offered finger. The boy looked up in delight, his face illuminated with joy and pride. "She knows me already," he exclaimed. "Of course she does," Matthew said, placing one hand on his son's shoulder and the other on Eleanor's. "We're her family." Eleanor smiled, exhausted but profoundly content. The journey had been unexpected, challenging, and at times painful. But as she looked at the faces of her husband and children, she knew with absolute certainty that every step, even the humiliating rejection that had once seemed like the end of her hopes, had led her precisely where she was meant to be. Home, at last. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.